If you are
En compte, finalement. Si, c'est bon.
if you are listening to the English translation, can you just make a sign, raise your hand? We're going to be able to start in a few seconds.
Florence Aubenas, donc, et Jean Hatzfeld.
Florence Aubenas, journalist, and Jean Hetzfeld, two great reporters and great writers. We could not dream of a better panel to talk about from reporting to literature, war reporting especially, since both of them practiced war reporting, to a form of literature or to literature. Thank you for being here. It's pretty full. This room is full. This is a great joy for us.
Assez rapidement,
Quickly, I will introduce our two panelists here on the stage, starting with Mrs. Florence Aubenas. It's the alphabetical order.
Presque canaise, enfin qu'il a été à une époque de sa vie.
She lived here for a part of her life in Caen.
Un peu désordonné. Enfin,
We're going to have a casual discussion. I hope it will be casual. Florence was, stop me if I say anything wrong. She was a great reporter. She's now a journalist at Le Monde. No one's perfect. Since 2012, you covered many war zones, Rwanda, Iraq, Afghanistan. You were made hostage in 2005. Since then, you have taken an interest
les invisibles de la société française,
in those who are not visible in the French society,
canaise,
which led you to become an inhabitant of Caen. You worked as a housemaid on a boat.
Cet intérêt pour les invisibles de la société
You
française.
have an interest for the less visible people in the French society. This can be read also in the articles in Le Monde.
Dans votre dernier livre,
In your last book also, which you published in March of this year, which had been expected for a long time,
en tout cas dans nos services,
at least in our services,
que vous avez publié donc après.
The Unknown from the Post Office. You covered a terrible incident in a small village in l'Ain. We will probably talk about that. I now need to introduce Mr. Jean Hetzfeld. I'm very moved to introduce him. This is my first time meeting him, even though I have read his books. He's also a former journalist from Libération magazine. We can thank them for being, in a way, organizers of this meeting. You created the sports section from an ideologistic point of view, and then you became a great reporter. You went to the Middle East, to Africa, to Croatia, Bosnia. You were hurt in Sarajevo, and then you started writing books.
De tous ces terrains compliqués, vous avez rapporté.
You have brought back many articles, many books from those war zones. One of the books which covered your experience in Yugoslavia. Then you also went to Rwanda. You discovered the worst thing there.
Vous en parlerez certainement.
You will probably talk about that.
Mais vous avez été un peu épouvanté par.
You were just appalled by the fact that the media coverage in Rwanda in '94 was not able to stop anything.
Vous êtes retourné.
Therefore, you decided to go back to Rwanda over and over again, and you wrote a series of books
sont des chefs-d'œuvre.
Which are masterpieces as far as I'm concerned. Until even recently, you've written several books about this region of Rwanda to try to understand and document what happened back then by getting victims to speak
qui ont
perpetrators, children to speak, and different people who took part
de 94.
or who were victims of this terrible genocide. First of all, both of you have an experience as a war reporter. I know that often this is taking place far. One good thing is to be able to travel, to discover new places. Yet, it's an amazing job. How do you become a war reporter? What was your background? What was your history? How did you learn? How did you discover this job? Hello. Hello, everyone. I was not called to being a war reporter, and it is not necessarily a term or an expression that I'm using so much. I'm more of a reporter rather than a war reporter. Rwanda, of course, is something that brings us together. For myself, during a short period, I was a reporter, general reporter. I was reporting various news at Libération at the time, and many journalists were going back and forth to Rwanda in '94, at the time when the genocide had started, and we were in this terrible season time during the genocide and just straight after that. So journalists just took turn, which is turning. So people were going one after another, going to same places, because we believed we had to have at least one reporter, if possible. For example, at the moment, if we could do it, there would be someone permanent in Afghanistan. So I was at my desk one day, and they were looking for someone to go to Rwanda tomorrow. There's a military plane tomorrow. Who could go to Rwanda? And you're sitting, and all of a sudden, there's an arm raised, and you look around, and it's yours. So that's really how it happened for me. I'm part of this generation, and I was so moved to see some photos outside of the halls. The main issues at the time were France and Germany, the making of Europe at the time, the Berlin Wall, etc. This was a time we were not living war but peace. Of course, there were still wars going on, but they were for other people, not for us. That was my experience at the time. Even in France recently, we've experienced war situations, which for my generation was a terrible surprise. So when you leave for Rwanda, you feel concerned. Of course, the genocide concerns each and every one of us, but it was not happening in France, and yet wars started getting closer in Europe and closer to us. And if I was to describe myself when I first started, I probably would have said a peace reporter, if I had to say something, because a war reporter is actually a war that came to me rather than the other way around. That's how it happened, as far as I'm concerned. What about you, Jean Hatzfeld? Things were easier for me. I was a sports journalist. I was a bit bored. And I had a first opportunity to go to the Middle East, to Israel. So I went to Israel in the occupied territories at the end of the 70s. And then we had Europe and Solidarność in Poland with a lot of enthusiasm. I was very happy. And in '82, a bit like Florence, they were looking for someone to go to Beirut, and there was no one available. And I said, well, why not? I got a book. I bought myself a book. It's a small planet on Lebanon. I flew to Lebanon, and the next day there was bombarding, and I was right there, and I stayed for days. And the third days,
j'ai tout de suite compris que la guerre, c'était pour moi.
And I realized that war was for me, actually, that I was going to become a war reporter. I realized that I was going to be passionate about this, that I would feel good for many reasons, really,
Évidemment, deviner tout
which I could not guess at first. It came slowly but slowly. But I realized that there were many stories to be told, that it might actually be easier to tell stories because of that extreme situations, because people were talking more easily.
Donc,
Florence prefers to speak to a farmer.
il y a une ambiance et puis ça
There
correspond
was an atmosphere,
de vivre.
and maybe it was my way of living.
De là,
And from there on, war
j'ai
became my thing. I loved writing about war. I'm, of course, sincere when I say I don't like war. Of course, I do not like wars. I am making a lot of nightmares. I've lost many friends, but writing about war is something that I'm fascinated about. Even as a reader, I love to read books about war.
Il faut dire, alors ça n'a rien à voir avec le Rwanda qui est
This has nothing to do with Rwanda, which is totally something else.
on y trouve deux choses. La première
War has two things. A present time, everyone lives in the present time, everything is shuffled, families are shuffled, everything is shuffled, which is why there's always euphoria at the beginning of a war. People realize things are changing, but they don't realize what they're going to be
crée aussi une façon
losing. It makes speaking or talking easier, really, at that time.
des gens se
I'm not one saying that people's personalities are revealed during wartime, but they are revealed differently. It's another way of looking at people, other love stories, other friendship stories, treasons, etc., that I really like that. And then from there on, I went to, of course, Lebanon. I was in Lebanon a lot, then to Israel a lot,
les guerres du Congo.
and the Congo wars, and I could have gone on and on and on.
Actuellement parce que
I would probably not have continued now because, and I will stop for now, but there's an idea that the wars that I knew had two advantages. First, it was you could travel. You could still travel in the Congo, in Bosnia, in Lebanon. Of course, there were a lot of risks. It was up to you. You had to go to the front line, and it was, you could be shot. But it wasn't the wars like the Vietnam War, or Algerian War. These were different wars, so it was wonderful to be able to travel, to make a living out of traveling that way. And another thing, which is a bit of a magic, is to experience a war from the first to the last day. For example, with Croatia in 91. I was in Croatia in 95 in Sarajevo.
de guerre qui
So wars sometimes last longer than a reporter's life, but in that particular example, I was there at the beginning and I was there at the end, so it was a complete mission.
c'est quelque chose d'assez extraordinaire.
It was an extraordinary experience. You were talking about traveling as if today it's totally different. Today you cannot travel in the same ways you used to, or otherwise you get abducted like Florence, or kidnapped like Florence.
La captivité, la capture est quelque chose.
Captivity, kidnapping is a terrifying experience.
Je pense aussi que toutes les conditions de travail ont tellement.
I think the working conditions also have changed. I don't want to get into details. I'm really from a previous generation, even with the internet and everything. Things have changed. So traveling does not have the same appeal. In the past, you were traveling and you would not, reach anyone or give any news for several days. Nowadays, you contact people all the time through the smartphone. So For me, traveling, which was, moving from one place to another, going up, going down, was something absolutely extraordinary for a journalist. Movement means meeting people. What you do at war during war times is the same as you do during peace times. You meet people, you listen to their stories, you write about their stories. So meeting people is a very rich aspect of that. And today, I think it's more difficult. We are more cautious. We don't stay as long. We don't have as much time. We stay a shorter amount of time. So the idea of being familiar with people, which is vital, in this job, you have to be close to people, close to events. That's something that has dissolved itself or dissipated itself, if you like. I think it's better now to do reporting when or where you can travel and meet people. Do you have the same feeling? Is that your same experience in the way that things have changed?
Yes, I believe all these reasons are true, the ones you just quoted, but the great difference is the place of journalists today. I remember the first report I did was in Rwanda, and at this time, it's in '94, we left, at least I did, with everything, all the gear that you had, something you wore on your arm, something on your card on your press. It was written all over the place, on your car, everywhere, and other tags and stickers on your car, no weapons on board, etc., etc. So it was it was a shield at the time. So I think if we put that, we're using this today, we would become a target. So this is one of the things I did. I went to Syria in 2012, the beginning of the rebellion from the Sunnite part of the country, and part of the country, neighbors of Turkey, had an uprisal, and it was the Arab Spring, but nobody believed in it in Tunisia, and we saw the government falling. But here, Bashar al-Assad said, okay, you can walk to Damas. So we were sure, we were persuaded, and I was myself sure that the government would not last and that the rebellion would, as for all Arab Springs, have a victory march. In Syria, it's a country, it's difficult to notice, but it was a very closed country, not for the certain guides were in contact with the foreign populations, but when you cross the border illegally, as I did before, when arriving like that, you are in cities where it's the first time that the population sees a foreigner and speaks to the foreigner. So you need to remember that it must still be the case today. Taking a picture, for example, of your wedding when you're a Syrian person outside in front of the door is forbidden. So it's a regime that is extremely closed, brutal, and there are very frightening, terrifying jails. And you arrive, and the people there, I was with a photographer, and people filmed us with their cell phones. It was completely new for journalists to enter these villages. So we were celebrated because seeing us meant we are going to win. Because journalists are coming, we had they saw our faces and they thought they would win. I went back 6 months later, and it closed up. The victory that was waited long for, in fact, led to a never-ending war. And with aviation, it stopped people walking who were fighting on the ground. And the people who had welcomed me, the same people received me once again. And before they were so happy, now they're starting to look at me more severely. They said, why? What did it serve? What good did it bring? So they were very defiant. And my next trip was postponed, and Didier François was sent instead of me. I said I couldn't because there were things going on. But I gave him the names of the contacts who had welcomed me so well. The same people
On a
took
des sentiments face à la presse, comme ça.
So you see the difference in the different symbols. So he was abducted, in fact,
On arrive.
which means that sometimes you arrive in the beginning, everything is fine, and then going to Syria became just unimaginable. Today,
Un pays
really, traveling to some countries, we see it in Afghanistan, in Syria, and a lot of other countries, Mali or others, it has become such a stake that it is better than any Berlin Wall or visa problem, etc. It is true that today, traveling, as we can see, it's as if the planet had become smaller. The countries where we can work now are in a much lesser number. So that is a big issue. There are dark holes in our perception of the world. Jean, what about this defiance,
Tout à fait journaliste, mais
this mistrust,
énormément. Et vous,
this suspicion with journalists? When you go abroad, not necessarily in war areas, but places where there have been wars, in Rwanda, I think you went back, and other places, do you feel this mistrust?
Il y a deux défiances.
There are two different kinds of mistrust. The mistrust that Florence described, because the character of the journalist has changed, it has evolved a lot. And
Il y a aussi
in fact,
quand même une grégarité du journalisme qui a
there's a sort of gregarity of
on devait
journalism.
passer par Sarajevo si vous voulez avoir. Bon, c'était un peu compliqué aussi. La guerre aussi
War
un terrain de travail.
was a workplace that was ambiguous at a time. And what I liked is the idea of war reporters, because it's kind of a corporation, so to speak.
Il y a un côté corporatiste.
And there's
ça nous sépare.
that is the difference between, it separates us. It's the difference between us.
Claire arrivée.
Marie-Claire came, different, all sorts of reporters came to these war zones. But there's a mistrust that has always existed
Quand même la propagande.
because propaganda is a weapon, a war weapon, in the same way as artillery is. And the use of the information, misinformation have always been weapons used by chief of states, and the journalists can be manipulated as stuff, as such. So you could very well go to Gaza, for example, be very well welcomed, because at some point the French president of the Republic had pronounced very favorable words for the Palestinian cause. Then you went back 6 months later and you were thrown stones at because he had traveled to Tel Aviv, for example. So the journalists are very well welcomed in Kabul currently. Yes, there's always this thing, but it is true.
Ce que décrit Florence.
What Florence is describing, I haven't experienced this because I started working on 2001 or 2, I don't remember. So I haven't experienced
C'est-à-dire qu'il y a eu
this. But first, the civil population is targeted, and then secondly, it's the foreign population, so journalists
influence.
and citizens, journalists have more influence, are taken as targets. So it is true that that changes a lot.
Enfin, c'est difficile aussi.
I don't know. It's difficult for me to express myself on what happened for 20 years because it would be dishonest. I wasn't there all the time, and I think the mindset has changed on the field as well. It's more easy to work with screens now. You can work from your car. I think other things are feasible. And before, we had to go follow the photographers. Now we see everything from images that come from all directions. You
sur
can
des sites.
work on internet sites, you see people speaking, and I believe that in papers such as Libération, it has also changed a lot. Someone was at the desk, and
Il y a quelque chose qui a changé.
I think things have evolved everywhere, in fact. So it would be dishonest to speak about this too much.
La génération d'avant.
I'm from the previous generation,
qui partait avec
the generation that left with a guide, like a traveler's guide, to go to Lebanon, for example. There's something interesting in what you said. You said one of the main reasons that you said you understood you liked war because it enabled you to tell stories. And in a certain way, it's easier to tell a story because everything is huge, they're tragic. There's more things to talk about. But for Florence,
en tant que reporter.
as a peace reporter, you have a job that is more difficult in a way. How would you define it? Do you, because reading you, there are also masterpieces to really catch things that have no
ou prétendument
relief, no
Du tout cette expression
shape. I don't like this name of invisibility. Why? Because I don't like it because I think all these people are visible. There's nothing more visible than somebody cleaning, somebody, a railway man or waiter. Saying invisible describes the one who's speaking, but not the one you're speaking about. And it means the one who's speaking about them doesn't see them, but this person does exist in flesh and bone.
Voilà, c'est pour ça que je n'aime pas cette
So
expression.
this is why I don't like this expression. But as Jean, I'm a journalist. I'm really a journalist, and I love this job beyond anything else. And I also love to go somewhere where things happened. And in Haiti, because the earth is shaking, and we talk about it. For example, a doctor would say, "Oh, beautiful cancer," but it's a way of speaking. It means that it's an interesting situation
Journaliste, c'est
professionally, but grasping a war, a very big event, if it's an earthquake or something else, we really have the right weapons to do that. We can have great titles in the newspapers. You can have, oh, something incredible just happened, etc. So we are really in our world. But speaking of daily life, little things, little everyday life events, precarious work, living in an EHPAD for the old people's homes, for example, or cattle breeders in the Charolais region in France. We could be a little heavy-handed and we can break the porcelain there, so to speak. So
dispositif que j'ai pris pour travailler.
the biggest schemes I used, for example, I hid my identity at some point to come to work in Caen, for example, and
Je l'ai fait non pas
adopting somebody else's role.
ou pénétrer, caché dans un pays.
For example, when you want to go to a nuclear plant. But I did this. I hid my identity to pretend I was a cleaning lady. And this is really to grasp what exists, what composes daily life. This is most tenuous and it is complicated. And we have a lot of weapons to use. But this work in Caen that I did in this way was a true discovery. Jean, when he says he loves war, what he says in his books is about daily lives as well of people. It's not just the artillery moving 3 meters further or shooting in such and such direction. It's also a lifetime during war. But
La vie en temps de paix est
telling about life in times of peace and its complicated aspects was a great lesson for me to confront myself to that. And I was really fascinated by it. I like both. I like working as a journalist in all its spectacular aspects at times, but I also like working in France.
Très bien. Alors, du point de vue de l'écriture maintenant,
Now let's come now to writing, to reporting. Writing, reporting is a cousin to novels, novel writing, telling stories.
une ou des histoires.
Telling stories, some stories with narrative techniques, different styles.
Est-ce que tout ça, ça suffit à
For you, it is enough to make a reporting a form of literature? Where do you put the
général? Et puis en ce qui concerne vos œuvres respectives, voilà.
limit? What would you say? How would you describe the two? Jean, you were a journalist first, you are a novelist, and you are also a writer. Regarding Rwanda, are these three different things? What is the difference between the three? Are they similar? How do you see this? I have a small head. For me, it's clearer if indeed there is a lot of the novelist in me. Writing novels is taking back what I have experienced as a journalist, the reports, and rewriting them under different settings. A novelist starts with the imagination, sometimes their childhood. My imagination is actually my years as a reporter, so I put this into some new settings, if you like. So that's really, my novels are totally connected to my reporting.
Par ailleurs, mon travail.
Beside that, what I did in Rwanda is also storytelling. It's not fiction. It's more storytelling. It's a bit of both, and yet it's completely separate. I have a working method, an attitude with my work regarding Rwanda, which I've never had before. I have another way of doing things, of being with people, of asking questions and working beforehand. Another approach, another way of working with the information that I collect. It's like a material, if you like. I'm really collecting people's comments, messages, stories. I've worked before. I did a lot of work upstream, and also I do a lot of work after receiving all the material. You have to be sensitive, you have to be delicate to make a connection. There needs to be trust between you and the people you interview. And then you have to work on the actual material, editing, and putting order in all of your content. So it's a bit more distinct than what Florence is describing and what she is doing. I just wanted to, what is Florence doing? Tell us about this. No, what I'm saying is, I'm talking about fiction and literature. In common language, often people are confused with the two. People say it becomes literature when it becomes a fiction. It's false, of course. Her reporting is very much literature. She's not inventing. She's making up a universe, etc. She's building a universe. She starts from something that is real to build something else. It's not an issue of being literature or not literature. It's not a matter of being fiction and not fiction. I think there are some reporters which are great literature reporters and others who are not. It's not quite the definition that people usually use to make the distinction.
Mais quand même, alors il y a un moment.
Still, at one point,
Florence va nous le confirmer après.
Florence can confirm this.
Mais vous avez quand même dit.
You said that in reporting there can be a little bit of fiction. Yes, despite oneself. There is subjectivity in your reporting. You may describe someone sincerely. You say this person is tall, is whatever. It's your own perspective, your own point of view. And yet this person may not be nice for everyone or great for everyone. So you have your own perspective either because we also have a time constraints. When you are doing a reporting, you are limited in time. You have to describe a situation.
Très souvent,
Very often, when you interview someone, you talk with them for about 2 hours, and you may just remember a few phrases, and the person may never recognize themselves in your article, not so much that they are frustrated, but because they may be surprised that you have only taken or kept a couple of phrases from the 2 hours conversation you had with them, and you've kept those two phrases and you've made up something out of it in connection with other things. So you've really created a character which is a little bit of a fiction because the person may not recognize themselves. So in a sense, there is a bit of a fiction.
tout le monde travaille sur la réalité,
We all work on the basis of reality,
non vrai, sur le faux.
and fiction is working on the false or the non-true, but yet it is not so true. Sometimes you work differently. There's always subjectivity in everything you do. Do you agree, Florence, with this? Yes, indeed. When I was a young journalist, I was convinced
On vous commande un reportage et
when somebody ordered a report and you may have an earthquake and this story exists and all you have to do is look at it and then tell the story. And yet the story exists. It's like what John is saying, it's the way you see it. When you cover large events like the Haiti earthquake, you see people under tents, all the refugees, or the victims. You may read 10 articles, and none of these 10 articles will look like one another. None of them are false, none of them are lying. No one could deny this event of the earthquake, yet everyone tells the story the way people see it and the way they talk about it. So these two elements are important, and it's difficult. It's one of my main issues, my main questioning really is
moi, la plupart
most of the time when I meet people I meet are not willing to be interviewed by a journalist, or maybe they just met me by accident, and all of a sudden you meet them and you say, I'm a journalist, I'm reporting, and then you present to them a mirror and they are asked to recognize themselves in this mirror, and it's not always the case. So it's a very difficult time, complicated time, this
c'est
awkward relationship, and it can be misleading, and there can be misunderstandings. Even today,
compliqué à gérer.
this has been one of my main difficult moments to handle, despite my experience as a journalist. Even here in Caen, I did a reporting on the Madeleine cakes plant factory. In this factory, the people who were working in this factory were calling me and were telling me this factory was making just traditional cakes, Madeleine cakes, and most of the families worked there all their lives, a bit like the Moulinex factory, where most of the families work there all their lives. And then all of a sudden, this factory is closing down, and we tell people, okay, this is it. Ladies and gentlemen, you go back home, and all these equipment is going to go to Poland. So all these women, these people who had no trade union, no claims, no other life, so all of a sudden decide to sit and sleep in the factory to contest, to try to save the factory. So I got there, I spent about 2-3 days with them, and we were talking quite
Les gens ont créé une forme d'intimité que
quite openly and with a kind of intimacy when you spend 2 or 3 days with people. So they told me this.
ici, nous, on est
Here we are only women. There are 2 men. One is a head, and the other one is a trainee. These are the 2 men, and all the others are women. Kevin is 19. He's the youngest, much younger than all the others, and yet he was earning 10 cents more per hour than all the ladies. And I said, how come? Well, he's a man, maybe that's why. And what else? And the 2 men also, every week, they get a big packet of cakes. What about the women? No, it doesn't matter. We always get some. We have a lot more than just a pack a week. And I wrote this in the article. I wrote that the ladies were 10 cents paid less per hour. And I presented this as something normal. None of them said, no, this is unfair. We're going to fight to get us 10 cents more per hour. And they were very upset with me. They were very mad at me. You are presenting us as resignated people. Of course, we were talking about them wanting to take over the factory, just to say that it's not easy. Of course, I wasn't saying this to be a nuisance, but just to explain why things had not changed for so long in that particular factory, because people had just taken things for granted.
mais qui était pour moi en tout cas significatif.
For me, it was significant because I did come to that place on the Women's Day. Anyway, they called me and they were in tears, and I was so mad at myself for doing this, because just to say, what am I trying to say? You want to do good, you want to tell a story, but you tell the story in your own way, and this might not be suiting for everyone else, and some people may not recognize themselves in this story. And that's one very complex and complicated relationship. Yes, the journalist may get hold of a story, tell the story in his or her own way,
Être vécu comme ça.
and it could be received in a different manner. One thing I have learned with time is to be very careful with the adjectives I'm using, the words I'm using. I remember one of my colleagues who was talking about a hotel where a robber had been, and he told the police, come get me, I'm staying in that hotel. The colleague went to cover the arrest, and he said the robber chose a pitiful hotel.
Moi, en tout cas,
Of course, the owner was not happy. Of course, today I wouldn't do that myself. I would just say maybe I wouldn't say a pitiful hotel. I would say a one-star hotel, for example. You see,
d'un reportage,
at the same time, is what makes reporting complicated when you're talking about people.
Pour revenir à ma question,
Coming back to my earlier question,
situe où la frontière
where is the border
entre
between reporting and literature? Do you think that you are making literature, writing literature?
cette idée
When did you accept the idea of writing literature? Is there a key difference between your reporting and your books?
je me pose pas vraiment la
I don't really ask myself this question.
question.
When I'm told, like you are saying today, that my writings are more like literature, I'm very delighted, very happy about this. Personally, I wouldn't say that for myself. Fiction and literature are 2 different things.
En tout cas, je ne fictionne pas. Alors,
I do not write fiction.
si ça fait
It's an exercise, really, I'm making.
le dernier bouquin que j'ai sorti,
The last book I wrote actually talks about a real fact, a murder. You did not attend the murder, so the heart of your book, the murder, how are you going to talk about the murder? Okay, then the
je ne sais pas s'il y avait un
murderer comes in, you weren't there, so you can't say that. Do you add a few things to reality? How do you tell this event? I like to do that. I love to
de récit
tell stories, whether in my books or in my reporting, using the technique of fictions, but not going that far as fiction writing. So for a long time, I was wondering how to talk about this murder
à ce moment-là, la Saint-Saëns,
without doing what I
Marie-Antoinette.
hate. At that moment, the murderer walked in and, writing a fiction around a reality. That's always a challenge when you are a journalist.
Indirect et
So I'm trying to write in an indirect style rather than having a false dialogue, which I would have made up.
taper sur les doigts.
But every time I have to really almost beat myself to say, no, don't. So I'm always careful to not do that. For me, it's a default. It's one step too much.
Ce point de vue-là, enfin, il y a
The book you wrote, The Unknown Man of the Post Office, without inventing anything, it's actually a book that you read like a novel.
mais oui, il faut le dire. À défaut de pouvoir rentrer dans le détail de ce livre qui mériterait
This book was a great book, and we could have a whole talk about it.
quelque chose que
Moving on now to another point.
sujets différents.
You write on different topics. Your ways of writing are different.
L'un comme l'autre,
Yet both of you use the same material, which it seems to me you talked about what you saw.
une maison qui s'écroule,
You do not describe a
propos recueillis sur des paroles que vous
crumbling house, but you are writing about words that you were told and that you heard. This is the basis of your work as a writer, or the basis of your books. For Rhonda, for example, and for Florence as well. You spend so much time because you went to listen to the different versions, the various testimonies, the various points of view. I was actually wondering, what is your way of working? How do you work around this material of the given word, with which ethics?
puis même techniquement,
And even technically speaking, how is this, especially for you, Jean Atzfeld? This is one of the reasons I wanted to meet you. What part of the work is a literature work? How do you go about writing about what you heard? When we read your book about Rwanda, it's like you're hearing people talking to you. Do you go through translation tools? I imagine they don't all speak French. They would not all be using French words. And yet when we read your books, it's like a natural thing. If you're not careful,
poser son micro et
you would think that he just simply recorded people in his recorder. When people ask me why I spent so much time on this story of Rwanda, I answer several things, which are common things like extermination is a terrible thing and genocide is terrible, but I also insist on the language aspect. There was a paradox when I got into this village in 98, 97, 98, 4 years after the killing.
Je lui ai succédé et après je suis revenu en 80.
And then I went back. So I went first in 94, and then I went back in 98, and I was facing something quite amazing, an amazing beauty of the landscape, nothing more beautiful than marshes,
Et la beauté du langage.
and the beauty of the language. And I often wondered if I would have carried on so much if there hasn't been that much beauty with a kind of a language. I was using images not because people are not used to talking or going to the main points, but because of where they were coming from, what they went through, the extermination. The only thing that was left was the key elements. It's not like in other regions where you might go, where You may have other elements, you may be talking about other aspects, or in order to inform or to cry or to claim, and you have nothing left really than your words. So it was also that which fascinated me.
En grande partie, et notamment la première personne que je rencontre.
And the first person I met in the village was a young woman, 35 years old, who spoke so beautifully you could just fall in love with her language before falling in love with her. It was that first thing. Language is, of course, very important. If it had taken place in Ukraine, would have been as fascinated. I'm not sure that's what I wanted to say anyway. There's a whole work around the issue of the question and the answers. First of all, you have to always tell the truth. It's my first time. I've always cheated in life, but for the first time I could not cheat. I had to make a trustworthy connection or relationship so that people could have no doubt whatsoever concerning your person. Landsman said, when you ask a question, you need to know what you're talking about. So silence,
L'objet, je pense, de notre erreur de journaliste,
which was probably some of our mistakes that we made as journalists, some of our difficulties at the time.
à cet événement, c'était le
In the face of that event, it was the silence of the victims that didn't want to talk anymore, or they don't remember, or they are afraid of not being believed. They keep quiet because they are afraid of hating themselves, or they want to be
course ou etc. Donc,
or remain silent because they had to abandon the children for all kind of reasons anyway. These victims had difficulties speaking and even saying the truth and saying what they think. So you have to learn to work with silence and with lying. For a journalist, this is extraordinary. For a journalist, lying or lies is a terrible thing. And yet it became a real center of interest. When someone was lying to me, I had to learn
pour laquelle,
that if somebody was lying to me, was actually the one thing that was interesting. Do you have a specific example to give us?
premier exemple,
First example, a young girl, 16, 17. I saw her. First person I interviewed.
elle avait été dans les marais, je savais.
She had hidden in the marshes for 6 weeks. She saw her mother being killed before her eyes. At one time, during the interview, about 10 minutes after the beginning of the interview, I said to her, "How long do you remember how long you stayed in the marshes?" She said 6 months. It could not have been 6 months. I said, "No, Jeannette, it wasn't 6 months." And she said 6 hours. And then I realized that time had no more interest for her. It was stupid for me to try to make her say something. For her, what mattered, that she had been there, she had experienced that, and that time did not matter.
C'est quelqu'un qui, voilà, c'était une Francine.
Or another girl, Francine, she was always lying
sur quelques jours de son séjour dans les marais.
regarding the days that she spent in the swamps, and I knew she had been raped. Many women had been raped.
Des tueurs qu'on ne pouvait pas mêler la mort et la vie dans la même personne.
And a lot of women were saved that way because the killers felt that you could not mix death and life in the same person. So the person I was interviewing would not answer my questions anymore.
Francine, je crois qu'on va arrêter.
And she said, "Well, shall we meet again?" I said, "No, I think we should stop here. I think I'm disturbing you." And she said, "No, come back again." What she could not say to me is that in the swamp, she had stopped loving her boyfriend.
À se toucher et de mots à s'échanger.
They had nothing left to say to each other, and she was ashamed of not having been able to love her fiancé during the time, not so much because she had given up her child.
Avec son
Someone else had to run away, and the child dropped, and he had to continue running to save his life. It wasn't even that for her. There were cases like that. Once Berthe got really upset, she was really angry. I could not understand we were talking about God. It was because I was insisting on the fact, I wanted to know how long they had prayed in the swamp and when they stopped praying in the swamp, in the marshes. And she thought I was trying to make her say that she had stopped loving God, which, of course, for a Christian is terrible. We believed in God the whole time, even otherwise we would be going to hell. So she thought I was trying to make her say that. These are the kind of things which you have to learn to manage.
Pour faire plus court,
To make it shorter,
moi je lis beaucoup.
I read a lot. I read all the books on the Shoah. I did not read any much at the time on Rwanda, but every time I work on something, I read all the books that have been written on a topic. If I write on children, on Jews, etc., and I have many questions.
Je veux être toujours
I
capable
always want to be able, when I meet the person, to be able to react in a way that would not bring about any silence. It doesn't mean that we're always talking, but you have to always give the person the impression that what they are saying is understood. The person needs to feel that they are not talking in the open, out in the open, but that they are understood in what they are saying. So you come up with your questions, you collect the answers, you go back to Paris, you lay out all your answers, you take pencils, blue for God, red for death, green for something else. You see, you put order in all your phrases, and you listen to people again. Then you realize you have not heard everything. You have to start listening to what you recorded again, and then you realize that someone said something important, that it would be good to get the other to talk about this. So you go back, and you have a second stay, a third stay, and little by little you move on, and then you start thinking about writing the book. So the work there is more like a movie of editing. You cut, you edit a lot.
Il y a des livres pour lesquels j'ai un
There are books for which I had a huge material worth 10 or 15, 20 books, and yet it came down to one book.
soit parce que c'est répétitif,
Either you take it out because it's repeating itself, or it's out, or because it doesn't fit in the book, or it's not interesting. For example, you interview somebody and you ask them, what do you think? Or do you think there could be another genocide?
personne.
You're talking to someone about this, and this person says, yes, there could be another genocide,
C'est toujours là.
since the cause is still there and it's not been solved.
La personne d'après lui dit
And the next person says the same thing, but you have to take out the other person's words because it's not fair. But if you repeat the same phrase 5 times, then, you have to take things out, and then you have to resonate things between them. So, for example, you tell stories through some episodes in some cases. For example, life in a village during the killing. So I wanted to have different persons telling me different aspects of this situation, and then somebody explain what life in the village was during that time. So you resonate between the various
alors il y a
elements that you collect.
langue, grosso modo,
So the work around language, roughly, that means that 2/3 speak French, 1/3 doesn't speak French. So there's work,
de formation
training work of the interpreter. You have to train the interpreter. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, because often people have a tendency, and Florence have noticed this, to summarize, explain, or shorten, remove what is not true, for example, or so, no, wait a minute, I'm interested in what's untrue. So sometimes I had to translate 2, 3 times, but yell at the translator.
Et donc, on a,
So what we did, this is the way I worked, indeed. In fact, it's a lot of work.
Florence, et puis après,
Florence, and then we will
d'autres gens que moi poser.
ask others, ask you questions. How can you have push people to speak about not necessarily traumas, but traumas, not necessarily war traumas, but something that happened? How can you make them speak, and then how can you make their voices heard? And then how do you introduce yourself? Since, yes, I think the way in which she behaves, she introduces herself to those people is quite decisive, very important. What does she say? How does she explain why she's there, what she's doing? So one thing, I was thinking of a story. It's a short one, I promise. You mentioned translators. Sometimes we work in Albania, in Rwanda, Swahili, these languages that we don't know. So once I went to Baghdad, and there was a movie theater, and we were told, oh, this will be burned down because the person is showing pornographic films. So it was a Muslim country, it was terrible. And with the translator, my translator, I said, okay, let's go ask questions. Let's go interview the guy who runs the movie to know whether it's a movie theater. The interpreter wasn't able to ask the question to a man in front of a woman, are you showing pornographic films? And he said, no, I can't. I said, please ask him. No, he said, it's impossible, not possible. So in the beginning, he said, you're going to repeat it to my wife. I said, no, of course not. So then what I did is I wrote part of my paper on this person, this translator, who wasn't able to ask the question on pornographic films. So often, yeah, of course, there's a real difference in the cultures, and sometimes I ask the translation, please tell me if this is a complicated question, it's not adapted, please tell me, but don't ask about something else. It's a complicated art to work with translators. More generally, in France, it is true that
on a parlé de la position
we talked about the position of journalists today, and we see this in Syria. You all know that it hasn't improved much. We are not well looked upon, and I know that there are colleagues from TV medias who now need to have a bodyguard. So there's a great suspicion.
C'est aussi une très grande différence par rapport au...
For journalists, towards journalists now, and very different from what existed when I began my work. I remember when I was about to interview a woman who had killed the neighbor, and I was told, okay, you have to go and interview this person. I was very scared, a long journey on the train, and I was wondering what I was going to ask the person. So I ring the bell, and I say, okay, I'm a journalist. I'm coming to interview you on your husband who killed the neighbor. And to my great surprise, the person said, please come in. I'm going to serve you some coffee. So she didn't know me, and she thought I was
années où j'ai travaillé,
harmless. So I think that now, yeah, at the time you needed to convince people to be less naive. Journalists, or most of them, are there to steal things from you. Journalist is a very general term, of course, a word, and there are many ways to do your job. But we see this regularly on the way people behave. And it is true that one of the keys not to do this. You have to stay for a long time in the same place, which means that you're not going to just spend 2 hours, take the train in the evening, write your paper, and never come back again.
Parce que ça a
Because that was very negative for the press image.
donc pour l'inconnu de la Poste, par exemple,
For the Inconnu de la Poste, the book I wrote, I
de la
said,
Postière.
okay, yes, hello, I'm coming to interview you on the murder of the Post lady.
non, on n'a rien à dire
And people said, no, we have nothing to say. And the
d'un fait divers
relation to violence,
est assassiné.
when something close is murdered, or whether in a genocide in Rwanda or violence on the warfield, on the battlefield, I
Intime que
acknowledged with time that there's nothing more intimate than this. It's very complicated to talk about it. Beyond
l'histoire du Rwanda
the
est
story of Rwanda, of course, is very complicated. It's a genocide, and it's comparable to nothing else, really. But in a general way, a soldier will not tell you about the war because it's very intimate. It touches on the image you have of yourself. It's extremely complicated. Same for
un tel.
minor news items.
C'est un vrai séisme.
It's a collective earthquake and interior earthquake as well. And when you say, oh, hello, I come from Paris, I'm here to interview you, what I do most of the time,
Cacher mon identité.
it's a problem. Of course, I'm telling you here in Caen, where I had to hide my identity to carry out my investigation, but
En tout cas, être franc.
you have to be honest. I think you shouldn't hide who you are. That is one of the important keys.
On est
And introduce yourself, say who you are, and not wearing a costume if you go to the countryside, or no, you have to be yourself. But and another thing, I have a great advantage because I said, okay, I'm a journalist, I come from Paris. First, usually people close the door, they say, where's the camera? No camera. Okay, good.
la porte se réouvre.
That's a favor. That's in your favor. So I'm still a journalist. I'm standing in front of your door, and then I see a person looking, squinting at me, and saying, "Oh, I know her, but where do I know her from? I've seen her before. Where? Is it in a club last night at the baker's? Is she the kid's teacher?" So I can see she's really trying to find where she knows me from, and then she says, "Oh, I know who you are. You're Florence Artaud." And I said, I say, no, she died.
Mais ça revient.
But that comes back often. So I'm happy to represent Florence Artaud, nevertheless.
Et c'est toujours la même scène. On se retrouve.
And it's always the same thing.
Viens voir, il y a un autre.
Oh, come and see, a hostage is standing by the door.
Je rentre. Et
So then I'm able to walk in,
donc c'est moi qu'on interroge. Et donc,
and things change, and I'm able to interview the people. But I believe I did things.
ils sont mobilisés.
I have a huge debt because a lot of people mobilized and did something else. Instead of doing something else, they agreed to answer my questions. And it is true that after some time,
La vraie clé, en fait,
the real key
c'est
to speaking, to having people speak to you, is staying there a long time and to know that if you went wrong, you need to start again. What I do now is something I didn't used to do in the past, and I hated as I started as a young journalist.
de
It is when I speak to someone
la communication.
for whom communicating is not his work. He doesn't have
com, qu'il n'a pas
a
d'éléments.
press attached, press.
La plupart des gens que je vois,
Most people I see. What I do is I call the person before the publishing, and I say, okay, this is what is written about what you said. And It is very rare that people ask me to change a quote, but at least it's reassuring for them, and at least they don't feel they're going to buy the paper and discover what's been written about them.
Mes collègues le font.
So most colleagues do it for Macron, our president, or politicians. I don't do it for politicians. I believe it is their job and they must know what they say. But I do it for those whose job it is not. And I changed my working method. I'll let you know if I change again. But for the moment, I think this is working pretty well.
Bien, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Je suis désolé.
I'm sorry, I must give you the floor. This is a little late, but they speak so well that it's hard to stop. We're talkative? You mean we're very talkative? No, you're good speakers.
Alors, je vous ai attentivement écouté.
I listened to you carefully,
Attentivement écouté, donc vos témoignages étaient
and your testimonies are fascinating, very touching. But the question is, according to you, is a journalist not a creator of conflict? And if he's not, can he or she prepare the field to impose peace or bring peace?
Jean, quelle est la responsabilité?
Jean, what is the responsibility of a journalist?
Vous avez parlé du risque d'être.
You talked about risks of being manipulating, conveying fake information. Yes, I think this is
Dans un
it's
autre,
secondary in both ways. The idea that information can help to go towards a better something. And I don't believe this anymore, and I haven't for a long time. And misinformation must be negative. I don't believe in that either. I think that informing, writing is good for brains, but it doesn't change history. We've seen it for wars, we've seen it for genocides, for even for minor news items as well. So we don't have the influence you could imagine one way or the other. So
désolé de dire ça.
I'm sorry to say this, but going to Palestine regularly doesn't change or unblock the situation in Palestine. And having worked on the genocide of the Tutsi will not prevent other genocides elsewhere. So I don't believe in that. I think that we overestimate information in a considerable way.
Moi, je suis moins.
I am less negative. I don't think, as Jean, that it really changes a situation for the better or the worse, as you had a tendency to say, for the worse. So it's true that battles,
Conflit, voilà, les choses se
different
radicalisent.
newspapers, you see, it is true that
Le journalisme ne fait pas.
journalism does not change a situation, but contributes to it. So this is one condition, a necessary condition or an obvious one, but not enough. It's not enough. It does exist. There are statistics that fascinate me.
J'accuse de Zola.
The J'accuse by Zola. He published J'accuse.
On est tous,
accuse.
on voit à peu près de quoi on parle.
You see what I mean?
Il publie ça
He
et
published it, and when he published this pamphlet,
je ne crois pas me
I
tromper.
think in 95% of the French press was anti-Dreyfus. And when it was published, there are researchers who looked into it and to see whether it changed people's vision or newspapers' vision before the publication of J'accuse. It went up to 93%, a very weak margin. Zola died in terrible conditions,
En tout cas, il est mort.
but he died before knowing that Dreyfus would be rehabilitated. We remember J'accuse, remember his courage, but now,
A contribué.
of course, it contributed. He's part of history. It was published in a newspaper, and Zola had this journalistic side to him. You just need to read his notebooks, but things take time. It's a small contribution, but it's not enough.
C'est évident.
Yes, this is obvious. It's obvious, but what I want to say, the fundamental problem of anti-Semitism in France does not change, which means that it's not because in terms of procedures, justice, legal procedures,
dont j'accuse, parce
there are certain steps.
qu'après,
There will be others in the future. What I mean is that, of course, there are facts that are going to change. It is obvious. It is obvious that in Palestine at some time, they were expecting journalists to,
et que si les journalistes ne venaient pas, ils n'attaquaient
if the journalists didn't come, they wouldn't attack. So fundamentally, the J'accuse of Zola, has it pushed back anti-Semitism? I do not believe so.
la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, probablement.
There are other issues linked to the Second World War. I think that fundamentally it doesn't change things, even though in the present times certain obstacles are overcome more easily. You can, at some time,
Où
as
le
for
récit d'un
minor news items, or in a legal case, the verdict could be changed. And there are a lot of cases where there's an injustice in a case. And
les grands mouvements de l'histoire, je pense que ça joue pas.
in the great movements in history, I don't believe it has much impact, though.
Donc j'ai une question par
I have a question
fiction.
about moving on from fiction to report.
Vous pouvez nous
Could
expliquer
you explain how, by conveying a message that must be clear and realistic, you can add fiction
du coup,
by maintaining the realism?
J'ai un peu répondu à ça, mais
I think we've already answered to this question, but Florence, perhaps briefly, the link between realism, fiction. For me, when we talk about fiction in a report,
Spontanément.
it's not something I would use directly, but you can call a fiction, you can
Un journal-
say whether it's a specific journalist looking at something, and this specific way of looking at things creates a form of storytelling that will be different of that of your neighbor. And you just need to look at the reports from the different
Donc, est-ce-
court cases. Is it fiction? Is it a different way of looking at things? Is it another way to tell a story? It is true that more and more American journalists have highlighted this. Truman Capote and others have
Pointer cette chose-là, cette chose-
underlined this by saying that the one telling the story is never neutral. The one telling a story has a way to tell a story, and this triggers a type of storytelling we could call fiction. I believe more than fiction or truth, I like the word reality. You talk about reality or tell a reality of a moment in one place seen by a person. And in this way, for me,
comment s'appelle ce qu'on...
how can you call what is produced? Is it a coverage, news story,
Fiction, pour moi, induirait...
a reportage?
En tout cas, moi, je ne revendique pas et je ne souhaite pas. Et il y a des journalistes qui adorent ça, qui
Some journalists love it and say, yes, I
envie
am
d'inventer
delighted to invent things.
des bidonneurs, on appelle ça des...
With news, there were really people very amusing and clever, people who were just inventing things.
une autre question.
Another question.
Oui, j'aurais une question sur le...
I have a question on the format, moving on from an article to a book as a writer. Is it because it's a greater satisfaction?
Le livre permet...
Can a book provide something different? It's an open question, really.
Contrairement à Florence, moi, je n'ai pas fait
Contrarily to Florence,
de récit.
I didn't write
C'est-à-dire, je n'ai pas fait
a
l'inconnu.
journalistic book.
Un livre très très particulier, comme le quai était très particulier, quoi. Donc moi vraiment.
So for me, a book enables me to do something very different. I write novels, so I'm not further from reality than I was when I was a reporter. I agree with Florence. In fact,
Elle est un peu floue et elle est un petit peu comme ça, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de gens qui sont considérés comme
a lot of people are considered as novelists,
tout a été vu et vérifié.
but everything
Des gens qui racontent des
and others
donc c'est
have
un peu compliqué, mais
journalistic types of writings that have been totally invented. So what I do is I use the same reality, which means
j'ai vécu,
from what I've experienced
etc. Mais de le mettre en
or
scène
something
différemment.
else, but
Mais là,
I
pour le
stage it differently.
respect pas
And
le journaliste,
there's a deontology.
le personnage, de faire dire à des gens des choses
You
qui n'ont pas,
cannot make people say things they haven't said.
etc. Dans un roman, je me permets de le faire parce que ça m'aide.
In a novel, I can do it because it helps.
Victor Hugo,
It's just like Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo, he must be flattered.
je le fais exprès, mais
C'est
c'est
envoyé
faux.
au...
I'm doing it on purpose. After having minimized the historical importance of Zola. Okay, this is why I'm doing it on purpose, because if you want the person who described the best social situation in France are not journalists, but the Misérables, the Miserables of Cosette didn't exist, Jean Valjean didn't exist, none of the characters in Victor Hugo's book existed. Gavroche really stays in people's mind because he's created universal characters. It's the same thing for Faulkner in the south of the United States. They are in reality. They are very close to a reality that is closer to journalists in Alabama could when they recounted the racist events in the 1930s.
C'est ça que je veux dire, quoi.
Le format, Florence, est
Format.
différent d'écrire l'inconnu de la
Is it different to write L'inconnu de la Poste?
de 200,
I think it's
260 pages.
260 pages long. Is it very different to write that or writing
Le rond-point de
an article for Le Monde?
ça, non?
Ah oui, c'est le gros
In fact, the great advantage when you write a book
fait réel, hein,
on real facts, as it is my case, I never write novels.
vous
It is that you
prenez le temps
can
que vous voulez,
write it. It's as long as you want. You really do as you like. So this is really
sans cesse,
great when usually you're a reporter and everything's timed very.
la montre contre les
You're
longueurs.
always fighting against time. So this is really great. But I'll give you another example.
J'avais couvert pour le
I had covered for Libération at the time the Outreau case. I think you remember. It's an story of
à Outreau,
incest
à côté
in
de Saint-Omer.
Outreau, next to Saint-Omer in France.
17 personnes avaient
Where
été
17 people had been.
donnant une dimension de réseau pédophile.
There was a pedophile network and a family incest story as well. So the children were victims, but it was a family incest story with
Les notaires. Donc quand on arrive,
When you arrive to cover this court case,
les monstres sont là, vous allez
people say the monsters are there. You're going to see with the smells of the first network in Europe. And I remember Saint-Omer.
de l'administration pénitentiaire arrive et amène les condamnés.
There were cars bringing the accused to
on
the
faisait-
court, and the children
Donc il y avait
went in, and there was a sort of a panic, horror
petit à petit,
was entering this court.
on voit ce dossier
When you see the file, this
PV
dossier,
après PV, mais ça c'est pas possible, mais ça non plus, mais lui pouvait pas y
and
être.
people
Et donc on
finally
voit
said, no, this is impossible, this couldn't have happened, and it's a terrible family. You saw everything being unknitted. And this is what I said in Libération. I told the story about these monsters,
ce réseau connecté à celui de
these
l'affaire.
rapes,
Petit à petit,
and little by little,
on bringuait là-dedans.
how all the people got involved, how out of 17, 13 were innocent, and the tree loses its, sheds its its
me dit,
leaves.
mais tu
And
devras.
someone said, "Oh, you should make a book out of it." And I said, "Oh, I wrote so many articles for Libération. In fact, it's even I've nothing else to say than what I have already written."
L'idée m'est
And
venue.
little by little, the idea was born, and I wrote the book. Why? Because I was interested at some point to tell the story backwards, and that's the book.
Le récit journalistique
The journalistic story over the 4 month of trial is about how the story changes shape, appearance, and how from something great you see the family incest story, and how the judge, how the police, how the social workers, thinking they were doing things well, why wouldn't you defend stories who said they were raped, created a
judiciaire
legal
grande.
outstanding story and one of the biggest legal mistakes. So I was able to, it helped me write the story backwards, and I like this technique
L'écriture, comment
of
fabrique les trucs
writing,
dans les
how do
cuisines, enfin
you
l'écriture.
create things. And I loved it. I was interested to see
On raconte une histoire de l'autre.
how a story could be told, why the judge believed this, who was this woman, how Myriam Badawi became Myriam
Donc voilà.
Badawi, the main
C'est comme ça que j'ai commencé à faire des livres. Ça me permettait de raconter des histoires.
protagonist. And so I learned how to tell stories differently.
Est-ce qu'il y a une dernière?
One last question.
Euh,
Attends, j'en voulais juste ajouter
vous
quelque
voulez
chose.
demander quelque chose?
Did you want to say something?
C'est vous? Oui, vous? Non? Ça vous est passé?
Non, attends, Jean Hatzfeld, vous vouliez ajouter quelque chose sur cette question du format?
Oui, non, moi je suis ravie de vous écouter.
I'm delighted to listen to you.
Oui,
I'm delighted to listen to you. I think what you're sharing is how people are also participating in your writings.
ces femmes qui ont
When you talk to us about these women who were upset with you, maybe if you had told them about the content, I think it's very important for people to be informed of what it is you are saying. When I listen to you, I can realize that it requires a lot of skills
écriture, mais aussi par rapport
besides writings, but also the way you understand people, their difficulties.
très attentive.
I can see how both of you are very attentive and being careful in trying to understand people.
Alors, est-ce qu'on a le droit à une vraie dernière question?
Do we have time for a last real question?
Au début. Est-ce que c'est plus facile?
Is it easier?
Est-ce que c'est plus facile
Is it easier
écrire comme
to write
le
a special reporter, going to places, exotic places, or to face
souffrance
suffering and poverty in your own country?
poétiquement
For me, it would be much harder to write about places,
Yorkshire,
about
euh,
foreign exotic places rather than write about, suburbs. When you, in Yorkshire, for example,
est-ce que c'est plus difficile
is it more difficult to do that
invisible
with those who are considered as invisibles?
que le maître Zola, Jean, vous,
Sticking to Zola
pardon, Zola,
and Victor Hugo as well,
qu'on arrive à une essence de vérité.
would you say that we come to a truth that is truer than truth?
Le problème est
You talked about silence and lying.
journalistique parce que Zola est
This journalistic fiction, Zola was on site.
une essence de la vérité plus vraie que la vérité. Ah, en fait,
Alors, comme dernière question ramassée qui permet...
A last question for a final word. Conclusion is actually opening up a lot of perspective. You have 1 minute left.
Je n'ai absolument pas dit que je voyais de la fiction sur les livres au Rwanda, je pense pas du tout. Est-ce que
I did not say that I would see fictions in the books about Rwanda. Is it easier or not so easy?
après c'est une histoire de passion, quoi.
It's all about passion.
À un moment donné, quand on écrit, on est hanté.
When you write, you are haunted by things,
C'est difficile, mais
which may be difficult or not difficult, but you could be haunted
hanté par l'affaire de Nyamata, ces deux affaires.
by Thomasin or Nyamata story. There are two stories,
Difficile.
and you don't ask yourself whether or not it is difficult.
La vérité, je pense que non, parce que sinon,
Are we getting closer to the truth?
parce qu'on aurait compris
Probably not.
un certain nombre d'années. Donc non, chaque fait divers étant différent, chaque guerre étant différente, chaque dialogue étant différent, non, ils se nourrissent les uns les autres, ils nourrissent une curiosité qui va grandissante. Et maintenant, je voulais juste répondre très brièvement à la dame sur le livre, la longueur et ça. L'avantage, enfin, ce qui distingue, c'est pas un avantage ni un désavantage, mais ce qui distingue beaucoup le reportage du livre, c'est la présence du lecteur dans sa tête. Un journaliste, il est payé pour faire un intermédiaire entre un événement et ce qu'ils vivent et les lecteurs qui s'y intéressent. C'est son métier. Son métier, c'est de faire l'aller-retour et d'expliquer. Et donc, il a le lecteur dans la tête. Il doit se poser la question en permanence de quelle question peut se poser le lecteur du Nouvel Obs devant le tremblement d'Haïti ou quelle question. Donc, c'est une contrainte supplémentaire. Ce n'est pas seulement une histoire de longueur ou de temps ou d'horaire, etc. C'est aussi il est payé pour ça. C'est quelque chose qu'il accepte et qui conditionne sa manière de travailler, etc. Un livre, on se fout complètement du lecteur. Enfin, celui qui se pose la question du lecteur est sûr peut-être de faire un best-seller, mais en tout cas de faire un mauvais livre. Donc à un moment donné, on est obligé de faire abstraction, d'écrire. On écrit pour soi. On écrit à partir de ses propres questions et des personnages qu'on a rencontrés et on se fout un peu on est très content quand les personnages de son livre vont rencontrer des lecteurs. Mais on n'y pense pas quand on écrit, sinon c'est foutu. Donc c'est une grosse différence.
Je voudrais juste répondre en deux mots à monsieur. C'est vrai, je pense que chaque pays possède les mots qui le rend fou. Donc en France, je vais faire le test voile. Bon. Banlieue. Donc, et par exemple, quand il y a eu cette paysan aussi, écologie, bizarrement chasseur, voilà. Donc chaque pays a comme ça ces mots qui le rendent fou, bête, où on arrête de réfléchir et où on pense avec ses tripes. Et donc là, on est souvent mal placé. Gilet jaune, c'était le cas aussi, en tout cas dans la presse. Et donc là, il faut faire un gros effort sur soi pour s'oublier et essayer de traiter les choses comme si on venait de la planète Mars. Donc, et ces sujets-là, oui. Les autres, non, le reste de la politique. Et donc, il y a ces choses qu'on voit comme ça, de façon aveuglante et tordue, et Brexit certainement en Grande-Bretagne, enfin bon, Trump certainement aux États-Unis, enfin, chaque pays a les siens, hein, ça on n'y coupe pas. Et donc là, par exemple, sur l'explosion des banlieues au début des années 2000, le meilleur bouquin qui a été fait par des Suisses qui se sont installés dans un immeuble qui a donné naissance au Bondi Blog et qui ont fait... Donc les Suisses, je vous parlais des tournantes au Rwanda, en Afghanistan, etc. Ils ont fait ça dans une banlieue française. Ils se sont relayés, ils ont traité ça comme si c'était une guerre. Et d'une certaine façon, ça l'était. Et les Français n'ont pas réussi à faire ça. La presse française, pourtant mieux armée théoriquement dans leur propre pays, n'ont pas réussi à faire ça. Donc ça, c'est le premier écueil. Les mots qui rendent fou et qu'on n'arrive pas à traiter, ou en tout cas, il faut essayer. Et la deuxième chose, sont chaque pays aussi. Alors ça, c'est beaucoup plus facile d'aller traiter les mots qui rendent fou en Angleterre, et c'est très amusant. Le Brexit, ils deviennent cinglés, etc. Donc ça, la distance joue en faveur de l'observateur lointain, enfin venu de loin. Et l'autre chose est l'inverse, c'est-à-dire c'est le principe de la lettre volée d'Edgar Poe, c'est-à-dire ce que vous avez sous le nez mais que vous ne voyez pas. Et donc chaque pays aussi a sa chose terrible, mais le travail précaire, voilà. Pendant longtemps, enfin, il a fallu Uber pour que ça vienne à la conscience. Mais pendant très longtemps, enfin, très souvent, une chose qui est les EHPAD en France est pour moi le typique de la lettre volée. C'est une chose terrible et en tout cas très mal maîtrisée, un angle mort réel de la société, un endroit où quand vous rentrez, on vous prend votre carte d'identité et votre carnet de chèques et voilà, c'est sidérant quand on y pense. Et quand vous dites ça en France, mais c'est incroyable, le droit des personnes âgées existe. Et ça devrait être surveillé comme un lieu de détention. Vous provoquez, mais non, pas du tout, ma grand-mère y est. Donc, la mienne aussi. Hein. Donc, voilà, ça, c'est vraiment les deux choses qui fait que la proximité joue contre vous. Et en revanche, chez les autres, vous les voyez tout à fait. Moi, je me régale des articles des Américains sur le édito du New York Times sur le vaccin en France. Les Français qui n'ont pas voulu se vacciner pour protéger leur grand-mère ont décidé de le faire pour aller boire un verre au café. Voilà. Donc, de loin, c'est plus marrant et ça se voit mieux. Et voilà. Et donc, je pense que dans ces cas-là, ça a cet effet.
Bon, merci beaucoup. On va devoir s'arrêter là. Je vous rappelle que Florence Aubenas vient de publier donc L'inconnu de la Poste, pardon, je commence à fatiguer, aux éditions de l'Olivier. Jean Hatzfeld, Là où tout se tait, chez Gallimard, et qu'ils vont tous les deux les signer dans une autre tente sur laquelle il y a écrit dédicace dans 5 minutes. Et à votre place, j'irai. Merci à tous, bonne soirée.